your people in the Old Testament, Israel. We just trust that it might be a chance to be edified as we look at your commitment to your people in the Old Testament and recognize that you're just as faithful to Israel as you are to us. You haven't replaced them. You haven't cast them away permanently, as Paul's made that clear in the New Testament. And as we look at some of what you've revealed about yourself and your relationship to them, we can see why that they're secure, just as secure in their salvation as we are in ours. And we thank you for your goodness, both to us and to them, and your grace as you've demonstrated. Amen. So we're looking at aspects of the Father. I've been looking several weeks at different titles or ways that God the Father is addressed in Scripture, and we're looking at some of the things in the Old Testament right now. And one of the things that is perhaps of interest to some of us is that in the New Testament, for New Testament believers, all three persons of the Godhead are involved in our redemption, but God the Son is the one who gets the most press in the New Testament for our redemption. In the Old Testament, God the Father is the one who gets the most press. Now, if you look at Isaiah chapter 63, we have a very plain statement to that effect. We won't go into detail on this verse this week. This will be for next week, but just to drive home the point, if we look at Isaiah chapter 63, verse 15 and 16. Verse 15 says, "Look down from heaven and see from your holy and glorious habitation. Where is your zeal and your mighty deeds? The stirrings of your heart and your compassion are restrained towards me. For you are our Father, though Abraham does not know us and Israel does not recognize us. You, O Lord, are our Father, our Redeemer from of old is your name." So here we see that one of the names that God the Father has is Redeemer. It's not reserved just for Jesus Christ, but God the Father is also called Redeemer. The word that is translated Redeemer here is the one that is used primarily emphasizing the Old Testament kinsman Redeemer, which, like I said, we're not going to focus on that this morning. That will be, Lord willing, next week. But we're going to look at several different words that are used in the Old Testament for redemption or that are involved with redemption of Israel. I came up with 8 different Hebrew terms that are used in regards to their redemption. There may be more. I'm not an expert in the Hebrew, but I came up with 8 different words anyway. And we're looking at several of them this morning to just kind of lead into what Isaiah 63 is talking about, and focusing next week on his relationship as their kinsman redeemer and what emphasis that has with the nation, and the fact that as their kinsman redeemer, that actually guarantees that they won't be cast away, because God the Father is the one that secures their redemption. And his ability to secure their redemption is just as effective as God the Son's ability to pay the price for our redemption. One is not lacking in their abilities or their commitment to provide what is promised with their work in redemption. The Son has completely met the requirements for our redemption, and God the Father has completely provided the means for Israel's redemption, completely 100%. Last week we used the illustration that perhaps it's an oversimplification, but looking at the idea of replacement theology, where a lot of people have this idea that the church has replaced Israel because of Israel's unfaithfulness to God. Use the illustration. Gary's not here, so I'll have to use somebody else. Ben, I'm going to give you $100, and you don't have to do anything for it. I'm just because I'm a good guy. I want you all to know I'm a good guy, because I'm going to give you $100, and you're not required to do anything. But you kind of throw some mud in my face, and so I decide I promised it to you, but I'm going to give it to Tim instead. And Ben says, "But you promised it to me. You promised it to Ben." It's okay. I got that covered, because I'm going to call him Ben now. So I'm still giving $100 to Ben, but I'm giving it. See, the point is, regardless of who I call Ben, I promised it to you. And if God made promises to Israel, he made those promises to Israel, and he's going to keep those promises. And so I can't justify breaking my word just by semantics. And that's what replacement theology does. It just It just uses semantics to try to give God justification for backing out on his promises that he's made. Doesn't change the fact I made a promise to you. That means if I don't keep my promise to you, whether I call you Ben or Fred or Adolf, the promise is made to him. And that means he has to be the recipient of that promise, or I am unfaithful. I'm a liar. If you believe in replacement theology, you believe that God the Father is a liar. And that's kind of shaky ground to be on. I don't want to be in the same location you're in case lightning strikes. But point being, God is faithful. God's made promises to a certain group of people, and he's going to fulfill those promises. And one of the reasons he's going to, not just because he's faithful, but one of the reasons he's going to fulfill his promises to Israel is because of the work that he's done and the promises that he's made in regards to their redemption. And God the Father is called in Isaiah Israel's their Redeemer. So we look at Numbers chapter 3. We have two different redemption words that are used here. Numbers chapter 3. Numbers 3, verse 49. I believe it is. This isn't in regards to God the Father, this is in regards to Moses, but here's one of the words that are used in relationship to redemption, two of the words. Numbers 3:49 says, so Moses took the ransom money from those who were in excess beyond those ransomed by the Levites. So we have two different words here. They're similar. One is emphasizing the cost of redemption, and one emphasizes the individuals that incurred the cost. In other words, there's a price paid. That's when you're talking about the ransom money paid. It's referring to actual dollars and cents, as we would put it. They might call it shekels and something else, but you understand the concept of money. And then the other word here is referring to the individuals to whom incurred that debt, that the ransom needed to be paid for. And so we have two different words here that are used that way. And it's perhaps it's a coincidence. I don't know. But this first word that we're looking at that refers to the cost that's incurred, it is only used 4 times in the entire Old Testament. And the book of Numbers is called the book of Numbers. Why? Because they numbered the people. Because they numbered the people. Well, in the book that is called the book of Numbers, because they numbered the people, the word that is used to count the cost of the numbers involved in paying a ransom is only found in the book of Numbers. And it's only found in book of Numbers chapter 3. It's found in verse 46, 48, 49, and 51. All 4 times that this word is used in the Old Testament is right here in Numbers chapter 3. And it's reversed to the cost incurred for paying the ransom. And here it's talking about Moses' relation, paying the price of a ransom, and to individuals that incurred that cost. We have in, let's see here, we have Exodus chapter 8, we have another word that's used. What's wrong with it? Exodus chapter 8. Verse 23. Well, let's go back to starting in verse 20. This is dealing with a section, a portion of the section that's dealing with the plagues that have been coming upon Egypt to encourage them to let Israel go, to exhort them to do so. We have in verse 20, the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and present yourself before Pharaoh as he comes out to the water, and say to him, let my people go so that they may serve me. So we have in this context here leading up the idea of separation. Let my people go. In other words, a separation dealing with God instructing Pharaoh to allow Israel to be separated from them. And that context carries on through here as we go to verse 21. If you will not let my people go, I will send swarms of insects. We'll just skip ahead to verse 22. On that day, I will set apart the land. Again, emphasizing separation. I will set apart the land of Goshen where my people are living, so that no swarms or insects will be there, in order that you may know that I, the Lord, am in the midst of the land. Now, verse 23. I will put a division between my people and you and your people. Tomorrow, this sign will occur. This word division is also translated redeem elsewhere. It emphasizes the fact that when a redemption is price is paid, there's a separation. In other words, Israel was in bondage to Israel, and God is saying that he's going to redeem his people. He's going to separate his people out from Israel. There is a separation, and this word redemption indicates, yes, a separation.
From Egypt.
From Egypt, yes, he's going, here he's not talking about redemption from sins, but he's talking, it's the word that is translated redemption elsewhere.
Israel.
It's going to be a separation. Yeah, Israel from Egypt. And this word is also only used 4 times in the Old Testament. So some of these words are kind of obscure words, but they are emphasizing different aspects of redemption. And this particular word is translated here division, but elsewhere it's translated redemption. And I just threw it here to show that it emphasizes that there is a separation involved with redemption. We also have this in Psalm chapter 130. The same word is used. Psalm 130. And we can see that this place, this word is dealing with the idea of redemption. Verse 1 says, out of the depths I've cried to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. If you, Lord, should mark iniquities, perversities, oh Lord, who could stand? So right at the very beginning of the psalm, he's talking about something that separates from God. Here, the perversities of the people are identified by the psalm writer here. I don't know who wrote this psalm, but it's indicating that there is something that has caused a separation. And that theme carries through this psalm. Verse 4 says, for there is forgiveness with you. In other words, there is something that can remove that division. There's something that can bring us back together again, but it's going to require forgiveness. But it says, goes on to say in verse 5, I wait for the Lord, my soul does wait, in his word do I hope. Here he's waiting for something specifically, and he's going to identify what that something is that he's waiting for. He's waiting for this redemption. He's waiting for this thing that's going to come, that's going to remove that separation, separate the separation so that they can come back together again. Remove the obstacle that causes the separation. He's waiting for that. He's not waiting. Well, anyway, let's go ahead here. I could get sidetracked here, but he says in verse 6, my soul waits for the Lord more than the watchman for the morning. Indeed, more than the watchman for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord. Why is there hope? Because God has made a promise that he's going to remove that thing that caused the separation. So there's a hope here. They're waiting for that event to occur. For with the Lord, there's loving kindness. With him, there is abundant redemption. In verse 7, and he says, he will redeem Israel from all their perversities. We have just a couple of words here. We have in verse 8, a third word that is used that refers to redemption, and we're going to be looking at this one next week. But in verse 7, with him there is redemption. With him there is abundant redemption is the same word that was used in Exodus that refers to division. So he says, with the Lord, there is abundant redemption. In other words, God is capable abundantly of removing that obstacle that caused separation in the first place, that caused the division. And so this idea of perversity that is with the psalm writer's mind, that perversity with the people has caused a separation from God, and they're waiting in hope of the time that God has promised to remove that perversity so that separation no longer exists. That which separates now is gone, and so his people can now be reunited. And they're waiting in hope, which indicates that God has promised to do this. If God doesn't do this, God's a liar because he has made this promise. That's why they have a hope. We're made it abundantly clear in the New Testament that if we have a hope, it's because God has made a promise. And God has demonstrated over and over, I would almost say ad nauseum, except it's not nauseous, doesn't make me nauseous, it makes me glad that God has revealed he is a very faithful God. He always accomplishes what he says he will do. And if God says, I'm going to give Ben $100, that means he's not going to give it to somebody else. He's going to give it to Ben. And so Ben can have hope. He might not know when that $100 is going to come because I haven't told him when I'm going to give it to him. But he can have hope because if he believes that I'm faithful, and if I genuinely have an attribute that is called truth, and I have an attribute that is called righteousness, and if I have an attribute that is called holiness, then I am going to fulfill what I promised to him and not take what I promised him and just decide that I'm going to give it to somebody else. So God has promised Israel that he's going to remove that thing that caused the separation. Israel's not going to remove it. They don't have the capability of doing it. But God the Father does have the capability of doing it. God the Father has the capability of redeeming his people, just the same as he has the capability of removing what causes our separation from God. He has the capability of removing what separated Israel from God. And here we're emphasizing the Father's work in this. God the Son plays a role in this also. But in the Old Testament, the emphasis, God the Father is getting the press here. In the New Testament, God the Son gets most of the press. But as I want to emphasize, all three persons of the Godhead are involved in this. But we're emphasizing here God the Father's role here in the Old Testament. So this word emphasizes the separation. The first two words we looked at indicate the cost incurred, the price incurred, and the people that incurred that debt. Here we're talking about the thing that causes the separation. And this psalmist is looking forward to that time that has been promised when that which has caused separation will be removed, because there has been the thing that causes separation incurs a cost. It's not that God just because he just loves everybody and he just ignores their perversity. That seems to be the idea that a lot of Christians have about God's grace and goodness, is that he just overlooks perversity, that he overlooks sin, that he overlooks unrighteousness, and he doesn't overlook these things. There is a cost involved. The element of grace just comes in to demonstrate that even though I've incurred a debt, I don't pay the debt. Jesus Christ paid my debt. Here it's emphasizing God the Father's goodness and his grace, in that he is going to remove their perversity. But he does say there's a debt incurred, but Israel's not going to pay that debt. Ultimately, there is a debt incurred. God the Son ultimately is going to be the one who removes that through his sacrifice on the cross, just as his blood paid the price for our redemption. Israel had to wait for that, but interestingly, that in time there was animal sacrifices involved, and David makes a comment in Isaiah chapter, well, not Isaiah, is it? Where did I have it? Is it Isaiah? No, 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel. I'm not going to find David saying much in Isaiah. 2 Samuel, chapter 24. He's not talking about redemption here, but David understands a little bit about why there is animal sacrifices incurred.
What chapter?
Isaiah, 2 Samuel 24. Not Isaiah on my brain here. I can't spit it out. Isaiah, 2 Samuel chapter 24. You got to take me for what I mean, not what I say. Isaiah Boy, boy, I got on a string here. I can't let go of it. 2 Samuel 24, verse 24 deals with David's sin that he had to come up with an animal sacrifice, and somebody offered to provide the means for that sacrifice for him. And this is one of the many reasons why David is called a man after God's own heart, because David recognizes that the reason that there is animal sacrifice, is because it emphasizes the fact that sin incurs a cost. And David says in verse 24, however, the king said to Aaron, no, I will surely buy it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. Here, David has to pay a price for his sin, make an offering, and someone offers to provide the means for that for him. And David says, no, I got to pay the price for my own sin. I'm not going to let somebody else incur the cost for what the debt that I owe. And so David recognized that there's a cost associated with sin. And in the Old Testament, to a certain degree, they had to pay their own price. Now, ultimately, this is only temporary. Remember, the blood of bulls and goats couldn't take away sin. This is the difference between atonement in the Old Testament and Christ's sacrifice in the New Testament. We get these words mixed up. You see it here all the time about Christ's atoning work. Christ did not atone for your sin. This is what Old Testament sacrifice did. Old Testament sacrifice provided a blood offering that was temporary, that covered their sin until Christ's sacrifice, and Christ's sacrifice did not atone for sin, because sacrifice, the book of Hebrews tells us, his sacrifice was once for all. The blood and bulls of goats couldn't wash away sins. That's why they had to be done over and over and over again. So it was a covering. It was just a temporary umbrella until something better came along. Christ's sacrifice did not atone, because Christ's sacrifice was a whole lot better. If you say Christ atoned for your sins, you don't consider his sacrifice any better than the sacrifice of a bull or a goat. When you say Christ atoned for my sins, you're saying, Christ, your sacrifice is no better than a goat. The blood you shed was no better than that goat that the Old Testament sacrificed. No, Christ's sacrifice was better because it washed it away. It didn't just cover, it washes it away. And so don't get the idea that Christ atoned for your sins, because his sacrifice is way, way better. It only needed to be done once. David's sacrifice had to be done every time he sinned, because it was temporary. It was an atonement. It covered over until something better came along. But David recognizes that his sin incurred cost. And the same idea with redemption. In order to be redeemed, it involves cost. But the idea of grace comes in is that Israel couldn't provide for their cost. God is the one who's going to provide ultimately for the cost of their redemption, ultimately. So we have this in this word here in Exodus chapter 8. We have another word here that is used. Look at Psalm 136. This is an interesting one. Psalm 136. Psalm 136, verse 24. Let's look at verse 22. Psalm 136, verse 22 says that even a heritage to Israel, his servant, for his loving kindness, referring to God's loving kindness, is everlasting, who remembered us in our low estate, for his loving kindness is everlasting, and has rescued us, here's our word, from our adversaries, for his loving kindness is everlasting. This word rescue is one of the words that's translated redemption elsewhere. And it actually means to tear away, to tear apart. If you look at Psalm chapter 7, this word is used to give an idea of the more graphic use of it. In Psalm chapter 7, verse 2. Well, verse 1, Psalm 7, verse 1 and 2 says, O Lord, my God, in you I have taken refuge. Save me from all those who pursue me and deliver me, lest he tear, that's our word, tear my soul like a lion. That's the word that is translated rescue in Psalm 136. So this idea that's elsewhere translated redemption means to tear away. It's used in reference in the context of rescuing Israel from the bondage that was in Egypt. He didn't just because Egypt didn't, the Pharaoh didn't just let his people go. God had to literally tear them out of the nation. There was a separation that caused a rending within the nation, and it's used here as a description of how a lion rips its prey apart. It's used in Exodus chapter 32 in an interesting way. Exodus chapter 32. Used 3 times in this chapter of that's chapter 30. Of the tearing of the way of the gold to make an idolatrous sacrifice. In chapter 32, verse 2, we have Aaron saying to them, tear off, that's our word here, to tear off the gold rings which are in the ears of your wives and your sons and your daughters and bring them to me. Verse 3, it says, all the people tore off the gold rings which are in their ears and brought them to Aaron. There's then verse 24 says, then I said to them, whoever has any gold, let them tear it off. So they gave it to me and I threw it into the fire and out came this calf. This is interesting because this is the same word that's used of a lion ripping to shreds its prey. We have Aaron here telling he's talking to the heads of the families to tear off the gold out of your wives and your daughters' earrings to give me to form this idolatrous beast for you to worship. Kind of gives 2 different connotations here. The fact that he tells them that you have to tear off your wives and your daughters' ears indicates that the daughters and the wives are kind of hanging on. They don't want to give it up. And he's telling them, yeah, you rip it off and I'll make this idol for you to worship. And so they tore it off their ears and gave it to me and I threw it in the fire and it just presto bingo whammo, this calf came out. It was magic. I don't know. Can't really explain it. It just kind of happened. But it indicates either that they were holding on for dear life, they didn't want to give it up, or it could also indicate the zeal with which they did it, indicating that they put a lot of energy into this. So they wanted this idolatrous calf really, really badly, and so they exerted a lot of zeal towards that. Because that also indicates how a lion goes after its prey. It doesn't just saunter up to the prey and give it a swipe and say, you're mine, let me eat you. No, it uses a lot of zeal, exerts a lot of energy in going after that prey to capture it. Well, it indicates that using that word here, that there was a lot of energy involved in this, that there was a lot of zeal or a lot of effort to make this happen. And this is the word that's elsewhere translated to rescue. We have the same idea with redemption in the New Testament. One of the words that we have in the New Testament for our redemption is that God rescues us from danger. Well, this is one of the words that's used in the Old Testament that describes their redemption, as Israel is also rescued from danger. And God exerts a lot of energy towards that goal. It's not something that is done lightly. God exerts a lot of energy in providing for Israel's redemption. We have, let's see here. Let's look at, I've got a few minutes here. The 3 main words that are used for redemption are, first one would be kana in Deuteronomy chapter 32. These are the words that we're going to be focusing on next week. I'm just going to introduce them a little bit here. And in Deuteronomy chapter 32, these words that we're looking at this morning are used very, very few times. The emphasis is not on these terms, but they're involved in Israel's redemption. The ones we're going to focus on next week are used a lot more. Like this one, Kana is used 85 times in the Old Testament, and it has a lot more information concerning God's redemption for Israel. In chapter 32,
32 or 2?
Deuteronomy chapter 32. I didn't say Isaiah this time. There is hope. Not a lot of hope, but a little bit of hope. Deuteronomy 32. God hasn't promised that I'll get my speaking clear, but I don't have hope. But Deuteronomy 32, verse, let's see. Let's start in verse 1 through 6. It says, "Give ear, O heavens, and let me speak. Let the earth hear words of my mouth. Let my teachings drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, and the droplets on the fresh grass, as the showers on the herb. For I proclaim the name of the Lord, and ascribe greatness to our God, the rock. His work is perfect. All his ways are righteous. A God of faithfulness and without injustice." Whoever wrote this, and it says this is a song of Moses, this is Moses writing this. Moses does not believe in replacement theology, because Moses believes that the God that made this promise is faithful, and that he's not unjust, and that he is righteous. So he's singing this because God has made promise to Israel, and Moses believes that God that made the promise to Israel is going to keep it. He says in verse 4, at the end of the verse, "A God of faithfulness, a God without injustice, righteous and upright he is. They have acted corruptly," referring to Israel, towards him. Oh, I'm sorry, not him. He's talked about the other nations. He says, "They are not his children because of their defect, but are a perverse and crooked generation. Thus repay the Lord, O foolish and unwise people. Is he not your father who has bought you?" We have our word to buy. It's one of our redemption words here, and this is the one that's used 85 times in the Old Testament. This is he not your father who has bought you? He has made you and established you. Remember the days of old. Anyway, going on and on. But he indicates here that the father is the one who is translated bought here. This word bought doesn't just mean to buy, it means to acquire. And God the Father didn't reach into his pocketbook and write a check for the nation of Israel. He acquired the nation. I believe he's referring to election here. He's talking about the Father's work in Israel's redemption. And he's not, we have the rock mentioned here, which could be a veiled reference to Christ, because Christ is identified in the New Testament as the rock. He's the one who followed Israel around in their wanderings in the desert for 40 years, that provided water for the Israelites. He was the rock that Moses used as staff and provided water. So we have, to them, it would have been a veiled reference to the Son here, is in part of his reference to his deliverance from the nation of Egypt. But with the emphasis here, the Father is directly identified here. He says the Father is the one who bought you. In other words, he acquired Israel. He's the one who, in Acts, I think it's chapter 15, says that he selected Israel from out of the nations. And it says here that he made them. And the word that is used here, we looked at this, was it last week or no? Well, we weren't here last week before last. There's two different words that are used in association with God's, the Father's choice of Israel, his acquiring them. It says here that he made them. And the word that is used here is asa, which is to mold, or it's used in the first chapter of Genesis to refer to God's renovation of the earth during the 6-day renovation. But there's another word that's used in Genesis chapter 1 called bara, which is to create of nothing. And that word is also used of God the Father in his redemption of Israel, and that's used back in Micah chapter 5, that he created them out of nothing. In other words, we have the statement that the nations were less than nothing in Isaiah, and that God chose Israel out of the nations they were less than nothing. So he made them a people who were not a people. They didn't exist as a people. And so out of nothing, God made Israel. And then after he created them, nothing, after he called them out, he began working with them and molding them into something. And so we have both words for create here of God's work with Israel. He called them out of the nations who were nothing, and then he began working with them and forming them into something. And so we have both different words that are used of God the Father's work in creating Israel, creating them out of nothing, and then molding and working with them to make them into something different than what they were originally in their natural state. And the word that's used here is to remodel or to mold them into something after he chose them and began working with them. And he is the one who acquired them. It says translated bought, but it means to acquire. It can mean to purchase. It's oftentimes translated to purchase, referring to money, but sometimes it refers to just acquire something, regardless of whether a price was paid or not. And so God the Father acquired Israel because he's the one that called them out of the nations. He's the one that chose them. He acquired them, made them a people of his own. In other words, they didn't bring anything to the table. They didn't have any value in and of themselves. That God didn't invest in them. He acquired them when they were nothing. And then he began working them to make something out of them when they were nothing. So we have this word here. We have also the primary word that that we're going to be looking at next week is in Exodus chapter 6, verse 6. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Exodus 6. This is the one that we're going to focus on next week. Exodus chapter 6, verse 6 is let's see, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, Exodus 6, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for under compulsion he shall let them go. Under compulsion, that's what elsewhere described. He had to rip them away from the nation. He had to tear them away. One of the redemption words. He had to tear them away from Israel. From Egypt. He shall let them go, and under compulsion he shall drive them out of the land. God spoke further to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord, and appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourn. And furthermore, I have heard the groanings of the sons of Israel because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage. I have remembered my covenant. That's another reason why God is faithful, because he's not forgetful. He doesn't forget a promise that he's made just because it suddenly becomes inconvenient. Sometimes we might forget a promise because all of a sudden we realize that it becomes a little bit more inconvenient. Sometimes you fulfill a promise so we can forget, but God doesn't forget. I have remembered my covenant. Verse 6 says, say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. The word that's translated redeem here is the word that is going to be our focus on next week, is the word that is translated throughout the book of Leviticus. It's the one that refers to a kinsman redeemer. We don't have that idea in our New Testament redemption that we have in Christ so much. We have it really emphasized in God the Father's redemption of Israel. And we're going to look at what being a kinsman redeemer entailed. When God says, I will be your kinsman redeemer, which is basically what this word is translated two different ways. It's translated as a blood avenger, and it's in at least a half a dozen places in the Old Testament, and it's translated kinsman redeemer most of the time, or redeemer, emphasizing that the blood relationship that the person has with the one that they're redeeming. It emphasizes that there's a family type of a relationship. The kinsman redeemer had to be a blood relative in the Old Testament. We're going to look at least three major requirements that a kinsman redeemer had to have, and see how that translates to God the Father's relationship to Israel and his redemption. As God the Father acts as their kinsman redeemer, God the Father has to meet at least three major requirements to be a kinsman redeemer. And the fact that that word is used here, it's a promise that God will be their kinsman redeemer. And we'll look at that next week, but this is the one that's primarily translated redemption in the Old Testament regarding God the Father's work in Israel. And it's used something like, I think 85 times, I believe, in the Old Testament. So it's going to be our major word that we look at. So here we have, there's a few others that are more obscure, but we're seeing there's a bunch of different words that are used for different aspects of God's redemption within the nation of Israel. And most of them are associated with statements that also emphasize God's faithfulness. So when God's saying his redemption to Israel, he's also emphasizing that he's fulfilling promises within the relationship that he has with them. And so he's promised deliverance. He's promised to separate that which to remove that which caused their separation from him, that perversity that caused their separation. He's promised to remove that. And so for God to cast away his people permanently because they did something that something perverse, God promised to remove the perversity from them. So they're not going to remove the perversity on their own. God says that he's going to remove that perversity. So God is not expecting Israel to behave in a manner that makes them worthy of being redeemed. God is saying, I'm going to do something that makes you worthy of redemption. You are perverse in and of yourselves, and you act perversely, but I'm going to remove that perversity from you. So if God cast away his people because they acted perversely, again, that just plain doesn't make sense, because God says, I know you're perverse people. I chose you when you were a perverse people. You continually act perverse. But I'm going to remove that perversity from you. So that which caused that separation no longer exists. I'm going to draw you to myself. So we have these promises that are beyond just land promises to Israel and things that pertain to them as a nation. Importantly, God promised to remove the very thing that caused that separation in the first place. And so if God has made these promises, the very fact that Israel acted perverse again, it just plain would be ridiculous to say that God's cast his people away because, well, they did it again. Well, he's going to be faithful to them and remove that which caused that separation. So next week, this is just kind of preparatory, just looking at some of the terms that are thrown out here in and around and about this major term, kinsman redeemer. But the focus next week is on his kinsman redeemer and the fact that the three things that God is going to fulfill is fulfilling as their kinsman redeemer is yet one more element that demonstrates why God the Father cannot cast his people away permanently, because if he cast away his people permanently, then God the Father would be disqualified as identifying himself as a kinsman redeemer. It would make God the Father unrighteous on a multitude of levels, because he's the very example of what a kinsman redeemer is supposed to be. And so that's our focus next week. This was just a race through several different words briefly to introduce the idea, and hopefully next week we'll get into nitty-gritty. And I actually closed pretty much on time. I'm trying not to hurt myself, patting myself on the back. in spite of my tripping over Isaiah. Father, thank you so much for demonstrating your faithfulness to Israel. It can give us, hopefully gives us so much more confidence in the promises you've made for us. And certainly if you don't fulfill your promises you've made to Israel, then we have no basis for believing that you keep your promise to us either. If you're unfaithful to Israel, if you have decided that you're just not going to keep your word to them because of their perversities, then we can look at ourselves and recognize the perversities in our own life and just have no confidence at all in the salvation that you've promised to us. And so we thank you that the things that we have from you are grace, and it's not because we bring anything to the table, but you are a gracious Father who provides out of the richness of your goodness and your love for us. And it's not based upon what we have to offer, but it's based upon what you have to offer. And we can recognize your faithfulness because you demonstrated over and over again to Israel. You're going to continue to demonstrate it to them. And we can have confidence, absolutely and assuredly, that you will keep your word to us, and all the things you've promised to us in grace will also be brought to fruition, because you're just as faithful now as you ever have been, because you're true and you're righteous and you're holy. And we thank you for all of these demonstrations of your character to us as you reveal your name and your character through so many different works.